-40. Forest. No metal whatsoever. Not a single nail. Yet a structure where 20 families survive winter, 1,000 winters in a row. How? We'll figure it out now. The Iroquois, or as they call themselves, the Haudenosaunee, lived across what is now New York State and all the way to Quebec. Their name translates literally, people of the Longhouse, or those who live in the Longhouse. And this is not just a name. It is a description of their entire way of life. Archaeological evidence dates this building tradition to at least 1100 AD. For nearly 1,000 years, this architecture was refined toward perfection. Every detail, a result of accumulated knowledge about heat, fire, materials, and the human body. Let's begin with scale. Longhouses ranged from 12 to over 120 meters in length. Archaeologists have found traces of posts from two giant structures, 111 and 122 meters, longer than a football field. A typical house was more modest, 20 to 25 meters, but still impressive. Width, about 6 meters. Height, also 6. The roof, not pointed, but arched, rounded. Now, about the materials. The forest gave everything. Small straight trees were felled, stripped of bark, and driven into the earth, tightly, row upon row. Between them, horizontal strips of bark were interwoven, producing a wall almost impervious to wind. The roof was built by bending flexible green poles into arches, and then covering them with large sheets of elm bark, roughly 1.20 meters by 2.40 in dimension, laid overlapping like tiles. Dried elm bark acquires rigidity and water resistance comparable to plywood. Not a single nail. Sections were tied with strips of fresh bark. While moist and pliable, it can be wrapped and fastened. When it dries, it contracts and pulls the joint even tighter. Suitable materials for this are basswood and hickory. Since bark can only be gathered in spring when the sap flows, the Haudenosaunee kept their stalks submerged in water to prevent drying until needed. The arched form of the roof, not aesthetics. This is an engineering decision. The curve distributes snow load evenly across the entire construction, preventing accumulation at any single point. The same principle found in the stone arches of Gothic cathedrals and modern railway tunnels.
Now, about how all this retained heat. Inside, the house was divided into compartments along a central corridor, 2 families on each side, and between them a shared hearth right on the central axis. A longhouse could have from 4 to 12 hearths, spaced every 6 to 13 meters. Above each, a rectangular opening in the roof covered by a sheet of bark that could be shifted from inside with a pole. But the most crucial element for winter survival, the sleeping platforms. Along the outer walls, at 30 centimeters above the floor, wooden platforms were built. On them, reed mats, animal skins, blankets. Beneath the platforms, personal belongings, food supplies, firewood. The physical logic is simple. Cold air is heavier than warm air and settles below. At floor level, it is colder. At platform level, significantly warmer. The beds never touched the frozen ground.
Jesuit missionary Lafitau described this in the 1720s. Platforms enclosed on all sides except the fireside, and serving as beds and benches. Mats and fur skins cover the bark floor of the beds. On these beds, Indians, wrapped in the same clothing they wore by day, lie down to sleep without any preparation. In winter, the number of people in the house increased. In summer, inhabitants dispersed to tend crops. In winter, they gathered. And this is not merely social tradition. This is thermodynamics. The human body at rest produces 80 to 100 watts of heat. 20 persons in an enclosed space, that is 2,000 watts of constant heating, regardless of firewood quantity.
And now, the most valuable scientific fact on this subject. In 1979, Canadian archaeologists conducted a real winter experiment in a reconstructed longhouse. 21 meters in length, 6 meters in width, 4.5 meters in height. Double layer of elm bark, 5 central hearths. The result? With minimal fire, only hot coals, without active flames. Interior temperature held between 0 and +2 degrees, at an exterior temperature of -15, a difference of 15 to 17 degrees. With active fire, significantly higher. Over 30 hours, participants burned 436 kilograms of wood, but researchers understood that original inhabitants maintained coals, not flames, and spent considerably less firewood.
But there was a cost. The researchers suffered smoke poisoning, runny nose, burning eyes, then lung congestion, headache, nausea, a condition where the air holds less than 16% oxygen and carbon monoxide prevails in the bloodstream. And this is confirmed by the bones. Analysis of Iroquois burial remains revealed about 60% of the population suffered from sinusitis, chronic changes to the bone sinuses from constant smoke exposure. Another study, 348 jaws from the Uxbridge burial, dating to around 1440, showed lesions in 50%. The chronic presence of smoke was literally written into the bones across generations.
Where they built and why they moved. Settlements were positioned near waterways, rivers, and streams. Surrounding them was often a triple palisade, 4.5 to 6 meters high. The center rose straight, the side ones crossed and interlaced, all sheathed in bark. This was not merely protection from enemies. It was a serious windbreak barrier, substantially reducing the impact of winter gales on the dwellings. But settlements did not last forever. Every 5 to 20 years, a relocation. When the surrounding soil was exhausted and firewood reserves in the accessible area were depleted. Wood to heat 12 hearths, that is a colossal requirement. The Jesuit missionary Sagard wrote, "They use only the very best wood, preferring to travel far for it rather than take green wood or that which produces smoke. And they maintain a clear fire with little fuel. Proper dry wood provided more heat and less smoke. This reduced both consumption and smoke poisoning." At the Longhouse entrance, a vestibule. In winter, it was sealed with bark and used for firewood storage. The airlock principle. First, cold air entered a closed antechamber containing firewood, rather than directly into the living space. A natural thermal buffer without any moving parts. Food. Corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters, formed the dietary foundation. Not mere tradition, this is a calculated agronomic system. The corn stalk serves as support for the climbing bean. Beans fix nitrogen in the soil and stabilize the corn against wind. Broad squash leaves shade the earth, retain moisture, suppress weeds. Modern experiments have shown this polyculture produced both more calories and more protein than any monoculture. Seed corn was left on the cob and hung from the rafters. Dried goods were stored above the sleeping platforms in bark containers, and they dug pits, 90 centimeters to 1 meter 80 in depth, lined with gravel, sand, and bark. Each held up to 10 bushels of food. Low oxygen content underground prevented spoilage. Clay pots were lined with bark against mice, filled with dried corn and meat, and buried beside the house. On clothing. Deer hide, soft, tough, more waterproof than the rest. Winter moccasins, taller, fur-lined. In the cold, men wore leather leggings and tunics, women, long skirts and leggings. In bitter frost, fur capes over top. A Dutch observer in the 1640s wrote, "In winter, they simply hang raw deer, bear, or panther hides on themselves, or stitch together several beaver, otter, marten, or mink skins into a square piece, and this serves as clothing." They applied bear or goose fat to exposed skin, natural protection from windburn and frostbite, especially during long hunts. And snowshoes, wooden frames fastened to moccasins that spread body weight to keep from sinking into snow. And finally, about the social structure as a thermostat. The longhouse is not merely architecture, it is a social system. Up to 20 families under one roof, shared firewood supplies, rotation tending the fire at night, mutual aid in sickness. In winter, this community literally served a thermostat function. Children grew up surrounded by the entire extended family, learning everything necessary for survival. Women controlled the house. They gathered bark in spring, built, and maintained. If a husband offended his wife, he might find his belongings outside the door. This is not a side detail. Whoever controls the house at -40 controls survival. Haudenosaunee survival is a system of 8 levels: arched construction that withstands snow,
dense covering of elm bark, the vestibule airlock at the entrance, central hearths with adjustable vents, sleeping platforms that insulate from the cold floor, underground pits and rafter storage for supplies, multi-layered clothing of fur and hide, and the community that slept, ate, and heated the shared space as a single organism. The price of this survival: chronic smoke poisoning and sinusitis in 50 to 60% of adults. But people lived, raised children, held councils, and preserved civilization through hundreds of winters in a row.